So let's set this up for listeners because, you and I have talked about this a lot. In fact, I remember probably the last time, this is pre-COVID because we were both in San Diego. You and your husband were over for dinner. I think I cooked up some fresh venison that I had just killed. And we were kind of talking about protein. And I think at the time, both of us were kind of struggling with two competing ideas in geroscience. And those two ideas that seemed dialectical, they seemed at odds, was on the one hand, there's this body of mostly kind of animal literature that suggests lower protein intake is associated with a longer life. But on the other hand, there's this literature that says lower protein intake is associated with more frailty in humans, and that's associated with a shorter life. So how do we reconcile these two things? And we didn't have a great resolution on that. I mean, we both kind of felt like we were sort of scratching our heads, thinking, at least, I don't want to speak for you, but my thinking at the time, this is again 3.5 years ago probably, was we just got to find the minimum effective dose. What's the minimum effective dose of protein to not undergo mandatory catabolism? And that's what the dose is. So, and of course, it's not clear how you find that dose. Theoretically, you would use a metabolic cart and try to identify nitrogen balance and things like that. But of course, no one can do that outside of a lab. So it was a bit of a head scratcher. Now, my thinking has evolved so much on this, but I'd like to hear, first of all, I'd like to hear your formulation of the problem. Did I formulate it the way you would? And I guess more importantly, tell me how you're thinking today.
Yeah, so you actually did a very good job formulating sort of my mentality with respect to protein intake and longevity back in 2019. Prior to that, but even up until not even that long ago, to be honest, there's like, as you mentioned, a large body of animal evidence, but also like there was coupled epidemiological data where people are looking at, vegetarians are taking in lower amounts of protein and their all-cause mortality and their cancer mortality. And there's just study after study after study. And they have a lower all-cause mortality, lower cancer mortality, but only in those individuals who are not obese, not sedentary, are sedentary, are smoking, or, they had some unhealthy lifestyle factor. So in other words, the people taking in higher protein, animal protein, who were basically healthy, had a similar cancer-related mortality, all-cause mortality, as these vegetarians. Okay, so
and similarly, studies where they normalized for fruit and vegetable intake, high protein versus low protein, no difference in early mortality, right? So yes, it seemed that a lot of the data that were espousing low protein were confounded by lifestyle choices, and high protein was also negatively confounded by high calorie as the most obvious.
Exactly. And with the animal data, and this is probably where my mentality has shifted the most, because I wasn't really of the opinion that vegetarian diets were superior to, meat eating, or I guess omnivore types of diets that were healthy omnivore types of diets. Like I like, because of what you were saying, like that data was, it was nuanced and it wasn't just like, so that wasn't something that has shifted in my, the way I've been thinking. But with respect to, a lot of the animal data and the, and the mechanisms, and you can, restrict a mouse of protein and make it live longer and not get cancer, and, all these things that you see study after study. I mean, it's just like the longevity science and that whole field is like dominated by that, like at least was. And there's now, I think, some pushback going on, but there's still a large, group of scientists that are, still, publishing lots of animal data. And this is where I sort of started to look into some of these exercise physiologists, people that like Stuart Phillips. I know you've had like
Don
Don
Layman.
Layman on.
Yeah.
Like exactly like these like giants in the field that are doing the research. And Brad Schoenfeld is another one where they're looking at protein intake. They're looking at strength training and its effect in humans, right? In humans, on muscle protein synthesis, and also just like looking at data with respect to muscle mass and all-cause mortality and Alzheimer's disease, dementia. We didn't talk about that, but like strength training also can modify that risk. Also cancer mortality. And so
strong grip versus weak grip, monotonic change in grip strength, 70% reduction in incidence and mortality from dementia. I mean, 70% reduction in risk. Remember, people don't understand, you can't reduce risk more than 100%. So it's not like increasing risk, which can be 100, 200, 300. When you're talking risk reduction, 70% is staggering.
It is.
Strength matters. Yeah.
It does. It does. And you're not like there, as you know, and many of your listeners, like there's two important signals for, your muscle. Strength, obviously a big component of that is like physically working them. But, protein intake plays a role there as well. And I think it was Stuart Phillips like phrased it this way where, the animals that are being studied in these labs are in a sterile environment, right? They're in a sterile environment. They're not being exposed to influenza and all these infectious diseases. And, like any of us we've had a parent or a relative or someone that has gone into the hospital and maybe had bed rest, and then come out and like I had a grandparent who literally couldn't walk after a back surgery. It was like, for forever, like that was it. That was like, that was their downfall. It was like the trajectory just went down, completely down. And, so losing that muscle mass, when you're in older age, obviously building up a bigger reserve in youth, like in middle adulthood, whatever, like that's very important. But like, these animals that like, people are manipulating the protein restriction in them, like they're not being exposed to that, right? They're not losing like, I don't know what percentage, like it's pretty intense, like how much they, you can lose from like 3 weeks of bed rest. And also like, as it's been pointed out by people on your I think Matt Kaberlein, like these, mice are dying from like cancer, right? Like cardiovascular disease. They're not dying from the same diseases. And it's not even the same type of cancer that humans get. Like right. We get a lot of these epithelial, like tumors, solid tumors. They're like dying from lymphomas, right. And like that's, so there's a lot of differences there as well. Where I don't like, there's a lot of interesting, and I'm the one I've talked a million times about animal studies. And I think they're important mechanistic data. Like there's things you just won't ever get from humans, but at the end of the day, I started to realize that, looking at this, mice in a sterile environment where they're not really being exposed to the same stimuli as humans, things are very different in terms of aging. I was like this, it was falling apart in my mind, basically. It was like all falling apart. I'm like, oh my goodness, this doesn't make any sense. Like this isn't what to be looking at if I'm wanting to really focus on healthy aging for myself, and for everyone else, right? So I think that's kind of what was the tipping point for me, was just kind of that realization of the importance of muscle mass and how, some of these animal studies you look and you're like, oh, they're a little bit of an improvement in their cardiovascular health. And I'm like, exercise. Okay. Is that better than exercise? No. Like the things that were improved, I was like, exercise does that. Exercise does that. Like, this isn't convincing me that I need to like do that, So, I think it was just kind of like the shift in the way I viewed the data, like the lens I was seeing it through.
Yeah. I'm still waiting for somebody to demonstrate for me that if there is an increase in the risk of cancer associated with higher protein intake in humans, I'd like to see that quantified. But I would like to see somebody demonstrate that if there is an increase in risk, that quantifiable increase in risk is greater than the offset of sarcopenia. Because that's something for which there is no ambiguity. we have all the data in the world to point to the devastation of sarcopenia on an aging population. And we know full well that two things have to be true to avoid sarcopenia. Adequate protein intake, which as you age gets bigger and bigger. That number goes up and up and up due to anabolic resistance, coupled with strength training. So here we have something for which there is no uncertainty. You must consume increasing amounts of protein, and you must do strength training to ward off sarcopenia as you age. And if you don't, here's your mortality trajectory, and it's awful. Let's compare all of that to this questionable risk for which, frankly, I don't see data. And I'll add one more point to what you said, Rhonda, which is I think this story got confounded by our good friend C. elegans, right? So let's go back 29 years, roughly, call it 30 years directionally, when some very seminal and interesting work was published looking at the DAF16 mutation in, or maybe it was DAF2. I can't remember if it was DAF2 first or DAF16, but it was the analog of the IGF receptor. And if you knocked out that gene, you could double the lifespan from roughly 2 weeks to 4 weeks, or 4 weeks to 8 weeks, I forget what it was, of C. elegans, this worm. And the implication of that was profound. I mean, I don't want to downplay the most important takeaway from that, which was lifespan was malleable. That turned out to be very interesting. I could go on my rant about why C. elegans is not an organism or an animal model that offers any insight into us, based on its cell, based on a whole bunch of things about its biology. But nevertheless, it somehow became knocking out DAF2 or DAF16 was tantamount to dropping IGF, insulin-like growth factor 1, to 0, is the key to longevity. And the way to do that is to have no protein. And I think that story is so incorrect, but somehow it's become part of dogma. So I think that's the other piece of this that just kind of won't go away.
Yeah, it's funny because I've done those experiments with my own hands when I was at the Salk Institute, and I was in Andy Dillon's lab, who had trained with Cynthia Kenyon, who made the discovery back in, was it early 90s or something?
Yeah, I feel like it was 93 or 94.
Yeah. And, it was very exciting for me at the time, because it was like, oh, this is a homologous gene we have. And I'm watching it go from a 15-day lifespan to like a 30+ day. And not only that,
the healthspan was remarkable. Yeah.
They were youthful. I mean, you could see them, you look at a microscope and you see how they move around. It is very apparent they were acting like a youthful young larva that had not been born long ago. Right. But then you also realize they go into this dour state where in order to get that, lifespan extension, they're like going into this metabolic stasis and this thing that we don't do, humans don't do doubt. We're not, it's a completely separate sort of pathway that is required for that lifespan extension. And I think, to your point about the IGF-1, the insulin, growth factor receptor, and also the insulin pathway, they're kind of both tied into that. The fact of the matter is that is a growth factor. And, as we have talked about, you and I have talked about this before, growth factors in the context of a tumor can allow tumor cells to override cell death mechanisms. So they can continue to survive when they otherwise might have been, signaled to die, right? And so there can be a problem with too much IGF-1 in the context of a tumor, and what causes that high IGF-1 is up for debate. But I think at the end of the day, it's not that high IGF-1 that is necessarily causing the tumor. I think, there are things that you can do in your lifestyle, like exercise actually causes IGF-1 to go into muscle, where you're repairing damaged muscle. It's helping muscle repair. It goes into your brain. It's important for neurogenesis. A little bit of controversy there, I know, but I am in the camp that you adults are, I mean, like there's studies showing, multiple studies showing that you can take an older adult, train them for a year, and their hippocampus will grow by like 1% to 2%. Like there's multiple studies. Also another study showing this with the subventricular zone. So these are two regions of the brain where it is my opinion, I believe data that says that adult neurogenesis, or the growth of new neurons as an adult, is occurring. And I think exercise is big.
And do you think that part of the vehicle for exercise to do that is through IGF-1?
Yeah, absolutely. It is.
Interesting.
I mean, animal studies have shown that. Again, we all know about the caveats. It doesn't translate to humans. We don't know. But, oftentimes you have to take the whole body of evidence, the human evidence, couple it with mechanistic data, with animals, and try to kind of put together a story to the best of your ability. I mean, that's all we're going to get, And so, IGF, like you always hear about, I want to lower IGF-1, but it's actually like important for the brain and important for muscle. And the way to get it to the brain is through exercise. Like that's known, and it's been shown again in human studies as well. So I think also part of the problem here is, in some respects, people that are doing, really impeccable animal research. Like you look at the data and it's like, oh, they're doing this study, great. Like this is a good study. I mean, like you can't poke holes in it with respect to the animal world. But then sort of translating that to humans and considering, like, who are we talking to? Are we talking to an overweight, obese person? Maybe they're probably getting enough protein. They're getting enough, they're like, I don't know that they have to worry so much about protein intake. I think they need to focus on losing that unhealthy weight.
Yep.
But that's also really important. And I think some scientists and also health and science communicators also sort of, maybe it's hard. You have to and I've been sort of guilty of that as well, like disentangling, who are we talking to? Are we talking to the obese person who clearly needs to focus on weight loss? Or are we talking to the healthy, physically active person who's now terrified to take protein in because they read about some animal study where too much protein increases mortality, right? So I mean,
and also I think age is such an important part of this again. So if you look at that, I think it was Levine in 2017 had that study where they look at the relationship between protein and IGF-1, but stratified by protein intake, low, medium, high. And then they looked at middle-aged people, so 50 to 65, and then people over 65. And in people aged 50 to 65, there was a relationship between protein intake and IGF. Higher protein intake was associated with higher IGF. Now, it wasn't a huge difference. This gets overstated constantly, but it was statistically significant. But what often gets ignored is the people over 65, there was no statistical difference whatsoever between protein intake and IGF-1. Again, this is taken as dogma that the more protein you have, the higher your IGF-1. And in people over 65, that's not the case. Now, why do I harp on that? I harp on that because it is in exactly that population that I am most concerned with sarcopenia. So if the message is somehow getting transmitted to somebody listening to this who's 65 or older, that I shouldn't be eating protein, and they might not even know that it's through IGF, but somehow high protein is going to give me cancer, and that's because someone who's telling them that is telling them that through the lens of IGF. The answer is, first of all, no, it's not. And secondly, the greatest risk you face, again, is going to be the results of low muscle mass and low strength. And even if we believed, which I don't, but even if we believed that in that age, in the younger people, eating more protein leads to more IGF, which is bad, I would argue that the absolute risk of death is so much lower in that group that the absolute difference in mortality between the younger and the older in the presence of high protein is no comparison. What I mean is, higher protein across the board is going to save more lives than it would ever hurt in younger people, even if you could convince yourself that higher protein intake was associated with increased mortality. And so, again, I find these data unassailable. especially in the older population. I think Matt Caberlin and I did talk about this on a podcast once. And I worry that, as you do, that information is not making its way clearly to people of the susceptible age group.
Right. And I think also that thinking about a lot of people are focused on the recommended daily allowance of protein, right? Like, well, then, right. Like, what are these old ass studies that were not done correctly using the wrong tracers? What are they like, what is that telling me about how much protein I should take in? And this is also another sort of change in it was a turning point for me, because I knew nothing about the fault, the errors in how those
the recommended dietary analysis was determined.
No, I know everything about micronutrients and RDAs, but I knew nothing about the protein. And once I talked to Stu, I mean, it was clear. He was like, "Oh no, those we repeated those studies, him and many others, using different tracers." And I can't tell you all this, the tracers and stuff, because it's not my field, but it was like, no, we determined that the minimum was really more like 1.2 grams per kilogram body weight, not 0.8. And to me, I was like, oh wow, because you don't store protein. So it's like, okay, well, this is important, because I mean, that's a big difference. And then on top of that, when you start to get into the physically active people or elderly population, as you mentioned, anabolic resistance, where they're basically like their muscle isn't getting that signal, as well to increase muscle protein synthesis from the same amount of protein that their younger self would, right? So they actually need more of a dose, up to 1.6, 1.8.
We're talking, we basically tell people aim for 1 gram per pound, which would be 2.2 grams per kilo.